Hey guys, tonight we begin with a pill bottle sitting quietly in a pharmacy. Prescribed, legal, insured, and containing the exact same molecule that gets people arrested in the parking lot outside. We're talking about Desoxyn, methamphetamine, brand name, doctor's signature, and all. Not the version cooked in a shed with a coffee filter and a prayer, the version with a label, a dosage chart, and a child-proof cap. So before you get comfortable, I want to say a genuine thank you to the viewer who requested this one. Your suggestions genuinely shape where this channel goes, and I appreciate every one of you who takes the time to leave them. If you like what you hear tonight, consider liking the video and subscribing, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. No pressure, and if you'd rather drift off with just the audio, we're now live on Spotify too, links in the description. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and get yourself comfortable. Tuck the blanket in. We're going somewhere strange tonight. Have you ever wondered how a drug can be a felony in one hand and a monthly refill in the other? How the same chemical structure ends up in both a DEA evidence locker and a child's medicine cabinet? Would you have taken it if your doctor handed it to you in 1944 for being a little overweight? Would you have questioned a pill that made you feel like you could finally get through the day? Or would you have just said thank you and asked for a refill? What happens to a drug's reputation when half the country is terrified of it, and the other half is running a legitimate manufacturing line to produce it? Congratulations, you've just woken up in a world where methamphetamine has a prescribing physician. Let's find out how that happened. Long before Desoxyn had a pill bottle or a prescribing physician, methamphetamine had a birthplace, and it wasn't a back alley or a biker gang's garage. It was a legitimate pharmaceutical laboratory in 1930s Germany, where chemists were chasing a slightly more potent cousin of a molecule that had already made its debut a few decades earlier. The molecule in question was amphetamine, first synthesized back in 1887 by a Romanian chemist who, at the time, had no idea he'd created something that would eventually power tank divisions and diet clinics alike. Methamphetamine came later, refined by a Japanese chemist in 1893, but it was in Germany, decades on, that the compound found its true commercial calling. German pharmaceutical firms in the interwar period were obsessed with productivity in a way that feels almost eerily modern. The country was rebuilding, rearming, and racing to prove that its scientific institutions hadn't been diminished by the previous war. Into this atmosphere walked a molecule that promised something no other drug on the market could: sustained wakefulness, elevated mood, and a near-total suppression of fatigue, all from a white crystalline powder that dissolved easily and acted fast. Picture the laboratory itself, not glamorous, not sinister in the way movies like to portray secret Nazi science. Just rows of glass beakers, the low hum of ventilation, chemists in white coats testing dosages on themselves because that's simply how pharmacology worked before institutional review boards existed. Ever tried to test a new energy drink recipe by drinking it yourself at increasing concentrations until your hands shake? That was Tuesday for these guys. The methamphetamine molecule they isolated was chemically almost identical to the amphetamine already circulating in cold remedies and diet aids. But it crossed into the brain faster and hit harder, like the difference between a polite knock and someone kicking your door down. What made this discovery particularly seductive to the pharmaceutical industry of the time wasn't just the effect, it was the packaging of the effect. Fatigue in 1930s Germany wasn't framed as a biological necessity to be respected. It was framed as a weakness to be engineered around. A tired factory worker was a national liability. A tired soldier was worse. And here, conveniently, was a molecule that could be manufactured cheaply, administered easily, and marketed as a solution to a problem the entire culture had already decided was unacceptable: the simple human need to rest. The chemists who isolated methamphetamine weren't thinking about addiction potential, weren't thinking about withdrawal, weren't thinking about what happens to a nervous system asked to run at full throttle for weeks on end without adequate recovery. They were thinking about patents, about market share, about beating rival firms to a compound that seemed, on paper, almost miraculous. It's a little like watching someone discover fire and immediately start wondering how to sell it in individually wrapped packets, rather than asking whether everyone in the village should be carrying a torch to bed. Within a few short years, this laboratory discovery would leave the realm of pure chemistry and enter German homes, German factories, and eventually German tank divisions, wearing a brand name that made it sound as harmless as a headache tablet. But that transformation, from molecule to mass-market product, required a company willing to bet everything on selling stimulation itself as a commodity. And as you're about to find out, that company had absolutely no reservations about doing exactly that. There's something worth sitting with in how ordinary this all felt at the time. Nobody in that Berlin laboratory imagined they were setting a chemical precedent that would eventually touch continents, wars, and pharmacy shelves an ocean away. They were simply doing their jobs, competent chemists in a competent lab, chasing a marginally improved version of an already known compound. History rarely announces itself with fanfare in the moment it's actually happening. It just quietly accumulates, one beaker at a time, until decades later someone is explaining to you, at bedtime, how a headache tablet-sounding brand name eventually connected a wartime laboratory to your local pharmacy counter. Before the Americans had Desoxyn, the Germans had Pervitin, and the company selling it, Temmler-Werk, wasn't shy about it. This was a drug sold over the counter, advertised in newspapers, and handed out like aspirin to housewives, students and factory workers who needed to get through their day. Temmler-Werk wasn't some fringe operation cooking up shady tinctures in a basement. It was a respected mainstream pharmaceutical company, and in 1938 it launched Pervitin with all the confidence of a business that believed it had found the next great consumer product. The advertisements read like something out of a modern energy drink campaign, if energy drink campaigns were legally allowed to promise you'd never feel tired again. Pervitin was marketed as a cure for low blood pressure, depression, and simple everyday exhaustion. It came in tablet form, in chocolate form, and was recommended for practically anyone who wanted, in the parlance of the ads themselves, a little more pep in their step. Imagine walking into your local pharmacy today and finding a rack of chocolate bars laced with a stimulant, powerful enough to keep you awake for 18 hours straight, sitting right next to the throat lozenges. That was Pervitin chocolate, sold under the brand name Hildebrand, marketed specifically to housewives and mothers who needed the energy to get through domestic labour that, frankly, deserved better compensation than a methamphetamine snack. The tins even came with cheerful packaging, bright colours, a friendly font. Nothing about the design suggested you were consuming a drug that would later be classified alongside heroin in terms of abuse potential. University students used it to cram for exams. Office workers used it to push through overtime. Truck drivers, always an early and enthusiastic market for any stimulant on the shelf, used it to keep their eyes open on long overnight hauls. And because it was legal, cheap, and endorsed by a respected pharmaceutical company, nobody thought twice about handing it to their teenager before a big test, the way a modern parent might offer a cup of coffee. Except coffee doesn't typically induce psychosis after sustained heavy use. The genius, if you can call it that, of Temmler-Werk's marketing was how thoroughly it normalized the idea of chemical enhancement as a lifestyle choice, rather than a medical intervention. You weren't sick if you took Pervitin. You were simply optimizing yourself, a phrase that sounds suspiciously familiar if you've spent any time around modern wellness culture, and its own fondness for unregulated stimulant supplements sold under names that promise focus, clarity, and productivity. What nobody selling Pervitin seemed particularly interested in discussing was what happened after the initial burst of energy wore off. The crash, the irritability, the slow erosion of sleep architecture that comes from repeatedly forcing a body to override its own signals to rest. Early users reported feeling invincible, sharp, capable of working for days. Fewer of them talked about the several days afterwards spent feeling like a wrung-out dish rag with a headache that could fell a horse. But by the time those side effects became impossible to ignore, Pervitin had already become deeply embedded not just in German civilian life, but in something far more consequential: the operational planning of the German military, which had taken careful note of a drug that could apparently make soldiers march farther, fight longer, and sleep less. And that, as you're about to discover, is where this story stops being about tired housewives and starts being about the actual mechanics of war. It's worth pausing on just how quickly this normalization took hold. Within a couple of years of its launch, Pervitin had become so thoroughly woven into ordinary German life that discontinuing it would have felt to many households like giving up coffee or aspirin. That's the real trick of successful pharmaceutical marketing then and now, not convincing people a drug works, but convincing them it was never really a drug at all, just a helpful little tablet that happened to make the day considerably more bearable, right up until it very much wasn't. When German tanks rolled into Poland and later France with terrifying speed, historians would later point to logistics, tactics, and blitzkrieg doctrine. But there was a chemical component too, one that rarely made it into the textbooks your history teacher used. The German military had watched Pervitin's civilian success with considerable interest, and in 1939 the Army's medical department began conducting formal trials on soldiers to test just how much the drug could push human endurance. The results were, from a purely military logistics standpoint, staggering. Soldiers given Pervitin could march for days with minimal sleep, remain alert during nighttime operations that would ordinarily require rotating shifts of well-rested troops, and maintain aggressive offensive momentum well past the point where an untreated army would need to stop and recover. If you've ever pulled an all-nighter fueled by nothing but desperation and bad coffee, imagine that same feeling, except armed, mobile, and rolling toward the French border at a pace nobody on the other side thought was physically possible. The numbers involved are almost hard to believe. In the spring of 1940 alone, the German military ordered and distributed over 35 million tablets of Pervitin to its troops, an amount that suggests less a cautious pilot program and more an all-in bet that chemically enhanced endurance would provide a decisive tactical edge, and in the short term, it did. The speed of the German advance through the Ardennes forest, a route the French had considered too difficult for rapid armoured movement, depended heavily on tank crews and infantry, who simply didn't stop to sleep the way conventional military doctrine assumed they would. Military historians now generally agree that Pervitin was a meaningful contributor to the sheer velocity of the early blitzkrieg campaigns, not the sole cause, but a real and significant factor that older accounts of the war conveniently left out. Of course, what worked brilliantly for a 6-week campaign became considerably messier over a longer war. Soldiers who had been running on chemical reserves for extended stretches began experiencing the inevitable consequences: aggressive mood swings, hallucinations, cardiac strain, and a dependency that didn't particularly care whether you were fighting for your homeland or just trying to get through another sleepless night in a foxhole. Military doctors began noting cases that today would be immediately recognizable as methamphetamine psychosis. Soldiers convinced they were being pursued by enemies who weren't there. Soldiers who hadn't slept in 4 days and were beginning to lose the thread of reality entirely. It's the sort of thing that happens when you treat the human nervous system like a car engine. You can simply refuel indefinitely. without accounting for the fact that engines don't hallucinate when they're empty and soldiers do. By 1941, German military medical authorities had begun quietly restricting Pervitin distribution, alarmed by rising addiction rates and the battlefield unpredictability of troops who were, in essence, running on borrowed energy with an increasingly steep interest rate attached. The romantic myth of the chemically superior soldier was giving way to the much less romantic reality of the chemically dependent one. But by then, the drug had already crossed an ocean of sorts, at least in concept. Allied intelligence had taken note of German stimulant use, and American and British military planners were quietly asking themselves an uncomfortable question. If the enemy was using amphetamines to fight longer and harder, shouldn't we be doing the same thing? Consider the strange bureaucratic paradox this created. The very military command structure that had authorized and distributed millions of these tablets was, within a couple of years, the same institution quietly restricting their use, having watched firsthand what happens when an army runs on chemical willpower rather than actual rest. It's a bit like a company mandating overtime for a full year, and then acting surprised when half the staff burns out. The causality was never particularly mysterious, just inconvenient to acknowledge while the offensive was still gaining ground. While German soldiers were popping Pervitin tablets, American and British forces weren't exactly abstaining either. Benzedrine, an earlier amphetamine, was already in wide military use, and it wouldn't be long before methamphetamine itself found its way into American medicine cabinets under a very different kind of branding. The United States military had actually beaten Germany to the stimulant punch in one sense. Benzedrine, a straightforward amphetamine rather than the more potent methamphetamine, had been issued to American bomber crews as early as the late 1930s, intended to keep pilots alert during long overnight missions where falling asleep at the controls carried consequences considerably more severe than a bad performance review. By the time the United States entered the war fully, Benzedrine tablets were standard issue for exhausted infantry, sleep-deprived pilots, and sailors standing overnight watches on ships where a moment of inattention could mean a torpedo going unnoticed until it was far too late. The rationale from military command was straightforward and, in its own grim way, entirely logical. War doesn't pause for anyone's circadian rhythm. Soldiers needed to be alert during operations that often demanded days of sustained attention with minimal rest, and if a pill could buy that alertness without the obvious drawbacks of, say, an entire platoon collapsing from exhaustion mid-assault, military planners were more than willing to distribute it by the crate. It's not so different from how a modern office might hand out energy drinks during a crunch deadline, except the stakes here involved live ammunition rather than a slightly annoyed project manager. What made this period particularly notable wasn't just the scale of amphetamine distribution, though 30 million tablets over the course of the war certainly qualifies as scale. It was the institutional comfort with the idea that stimulants were simply a legitimate tool of modern warfare, no more remarkable than rationed cigarettes or morale-boosting propaganda reels. Military doctors administered these drugs with the same casual authority they'd use prescribing aspirin, because in the medical culture of the era, the long-term neurological and psychological consequences of sustained amphetamine use simply weren't part of the conversation yet. Nobody was asking what happened to a 20-year-old infantryman's brain chemistry after 6 months of Benzedrine-fueled combat operations, largely because nobody had bothered to study it. Methamphetamine itself, the more potent chemical cousin already fueling the German war machine, hadn't yet been fully commercialized on the American side during the war years, but the door had been thoroughly kicked open. If amphetamines were acceptable for keeping bomber pilots awake over enemy territory, the leap to marketing an even stronger version for civilian use back home wasn't a particularly large one. The war had, in effect, run a massive uncontrolled clinical trial on stimulant tolerance, and demonstrated to pharmaceutical companies watching from the sidelines that there was an enormous, largely untapped market of people who wanted and would happily pay for exactly this kind of chemical energy boost minus the enemy fire. It's a strange thing to consider that the same molecular family keeping exhausted soldiers upright in bombing runs over Germany would, within just a few short years, be sitting on pharmacy shelves back home in a considerably fancier bottle. But that's precisely what happened next, when an American pharmaceutical company looked at the wartime stimulant landscape and saw not a cautionary tale, but a business opportunity waiting to be branded. It's tempting, looking back, to treat this wartime chapter as an isolated historical curiosity, a strange footnote confined to the specific pressures of global conflict. But the comfort with pharmaceutical stimulant use that the war years cemented in both military and civilian institutions didn't simply evaporate once the fighting stopped. It travelled home in the collective memory of an entire generation of returning soldiers, doctors and policymakers, all of whom now understood stimulants not as an exotic risk, but as an unremarkable tool, one that a clever pharmaceutical company was about to package for an entirely new and considerably larger civilian market. In 1943, a pharmaceutical company called Abbott Laboratories did something that sounds almost unbelievable today. They patented methamphetamine hydrochloride, gave it the brand name Desoxyn, and began marketing it as a legitimate medical treatment. Abbott wasn't a fly-by-night operation looking to make a quick buck off a fringe compound. This was, and remains, one of the most respected pharmaceutical manufacturers in the country, a company whose name still appears on products in your local pharmacy today. That's precisely what makes this chapter of the story so unsettling in hindsight. Desoxyn wasn't smuggled into the country or cooked up in some clandestine operation. It arrived through the front door of legitimate American medicine, with a patent, a trademark, and a marketing department fully prepared to explain to physicians exactly why their patients needed it. The name itself was a small masterpiece of pharmaceutical branding, deliberately obscuring the chemical reality underneath. Desoxyn doesn't sound like methamphetamine. It sounds clinical, vaguely scientific, the kind of name that inspires confidence rather than alarm. Compare that to how the same molecule is described today when it shows up in a news report about a drug bust, and you start to appreciate just how much power a brand name carries in shaping public perception of an identical chemical compound. It's the same active ingredient whether it's sitting in a pharmacy behind a counter or in a plastic bag changing hands in a parking lot. But only one of those packages comes with a friendly font and a dosage chart. Abbott's timing wasn't coincidental. The company had watched the wartime amphetamine boom closely and recognized that the American public, having just spent years hearing about stimulants keeping soldiers alert and effective, was primed to accept a similar product for civilian use. If Benzedrine could keep a bomber pilot awake over Berlin, why couldn't a slightly stronger relative help an ordinary American get through a demanding workday, lose some stubborn weight, or shake off a case of what doctors at the time vaguely termed nervous exhaustion? The cultural groundwork had already been laid by the war itself, and Abbott simply walked through the door that global conflict had conveniently left open. The early marketing materials Abbott produced for physicians read with a confidence that borders on the absurd by modern standards. Desoxyn was presented as a controllable, precisely dosed alternative to the messier amphetamine products already on the market, safer specifically because it came from a reputable manufacturer with rigorous quality control. There's a certain dark comedy in a pharmaceutical company essentially arguing that their version of methamphetamine was the responsible choice, as though the danger of the drug lay primarily in inconsistent manufacturing rather than in the molecule itself. It's a bit like a cigarette company insisting their brand is the healthy one because the tobacco's more evenly cured. By the time Desoxyn tablets started appearing on pharmacy shelves in the mid-1940s, the drug had completed a remarkable transformation. It had gone from a German military secret to an American consumer product in less than a decade, carrying with it none of the wartime stigma that might have made patients or physicians pause. What it carried instead was a prescription pad's worth of legitimacy, and doctors across the country were about to discover just how many conditions this new pill could apparently treat, a list that would grow steadily more expansive and steadily more questionable as the decade wore on. It's worth noting how little friction this launch encountered. There was no public debate, no hand-wringing editorial in a major newspaper questioning whether America needed a legal methamphetamine product on its shelves. The drug simply arrived quietly through the same regulatory channels that approved any other new medication and slid into American medical practice with the ease of something that had already spent a decade proving its usefulness on a foreign battlefield. Nobody stopped to ask whether battlefield usefulness and household usefulness were remotely the same standard to measure a drug against. If you walked into a doctor's office in the late 1940s with the right complaint, or sometimes not much of a complaint at all, you might walk out with a prescription for Desoxyn, and the range of conditions it was prescribed for would make a modern physician's eyebrows disappear into their hairline. Depression made the list, which, given methamphetamine's mood-elevating properties, at least had some surface logic to it, however misguided the long-term strategy turned out to be. But the list didn't stop there. Desoxyn was prescribed for what doctors called neurasthenia, a catch-all 19th and early 20th century diagnosis for vague fatigue and nervous complaints that essentially amounted to feeling tired and a bit off, the medical equivalent of a shrug wrapped in a Latin-sounding label. It was prescribed for alcoholism, on the theory that a stimulant might counteract the sedating effects of drinking, a bit like trying to solve a fire by pouring gasoline on the opposite side of the room and hoping they cancel out. It was prescribed for postpartum depression, for general malaise, and in one of the more head-scratching applications, for behavioural problems in children, decades before anyone had formalised what we now understand as attention deficit disorders. Consider what it must have been like to sit across from a physician in 1948, describing feelings of sadness, exhaustion, or simple dissatisfaction with life, and being handed a bottle of pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine as the solution. There was no extended conversation about therapy, no exploration of underlying causes, no waiting period to see if symptoms resolved on their own. Just a prescription pad, a scribbled diagnosis, and a drug that would make you feel undeniably, immediately better, right up until the moment it didn't. It's the medical equivalent of treating a leaky roof by installing a very impressive ceiling fan. Sure, the room feels different, but you haven't actually fixed anything, and eventually the water damage catches up with you. Physicians of the era genuinely believed, or at least professionally represented, that Desoxyn's effects were a legitimate treatment rather than a chemical mask over unaddressed problems. Medical journals published case studies celebrating patients who reported feeling energized, optimistic, and functional after starting treatment, without much follow-up on what happened to those same patients 6 months or a year later, once tolerance had built, and the original dose no longer produced the same effect. This is a pattern that should sound uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has followed more recent pharmaceutical controversies. The initial glowing reports, followed years later by a much quieter reckoning with dependency and diminishing returns. What's perhaps most striking about this era of prescribing is how little skepticism it generated at the time. Desoxyn wasn't treated as an experimental or risky intervention. It was treated as a reasonable, even conservative choice for a huge range of complaints, precisely because it came from a trusted manufacturer with FDA approval, at a time when FDA approval carried an almost unquestioned stamp of safety in the public imagination. Patients trusted their doctors, doctors trusted the pharmaceutical companies, and pharmaceutical companies were, unsurprisingly, in the business of selling as many pills as the market would tolerate. And one particular segment of that market, a demographic pharmaceutical marketing departments found endlessly appealing, was about to become Desoxyn's most devoted customer base. It's worth sitting with just how elastic the definition of legitimate medical need had become by this point. A drug originally patented for narrow, specific applications had, within a handful of years, expanded to cover nearly any complaint a patient might bring through the door, a mission creep that no single regulatory body was tracking or questioning. The pill hadn't changed. The diagnostic imagination surrounding it simply kept growing, stretching to accommodate whatever human unhappiness happened to walk into the examination room that particular afternoon. And once a drug earns that kind of catch-all reputation, correcting it becomes almost impossible from the inside, since every satisfied patient becomes another anecdote reinforcing the very practice that a more careful physician might otherwise have started questioning. Desoxyn found a particularly devoted audience among a demographic the pharmaceutical industry adored. Middle-class housewives looking for an edge against fatigue, boredom, and a waistline that wasn't cooperating with the era's rigid beauty standards. If Pervitin had been marketed to German housewives as a chocolate-coated solution to the exhaustion of domestic labour, Desoxyn found its own version of that same cultural niche in post-war America. Minus the chocolate coating, but with all the same underlying assumptions about what women's fatigue actually meant. The 1950s, American housewife was expected to manage a household, raise children, maintain an immaculate appearance, and do all of it with a smile that suggested she found the entire arrangement deeply fulfilling rather than utterly exhausting. When that expectation collided with the reality of human tiredness, pharmaceutical companies were more than happy to offer a chemical bridge across the gap. Doctors of the era, almost exclusively male, tended to interpret female fatigue, irritability, or general dissatisfaction through a fairly narrow lens, often dismissing legitimate physical or psychological concerns as simple nervousness or a need to buck up. Desoxyn offered a tidy solution that avoided any uncomfortable conversation about whether the underlying expectations placed on women during this period were themselves the actual problem. Why examine the exhausting, often thankless structure of unpaid domestic labour when you could simply prescribe a pill that made the person performing that labour feel temporarily invincible? It's the pharmaceutical equivalent of turning up the volume on a car radio to drown out an ominous engine noise, effective in the short term, spectacularly unhelpful in addressing what's actually wrong under the hood. The appeal wasn't purely about NG either. Desoxyn's appetite-suppressing properties made it doubly attractive in a cultural moment obsessed with feminine thinness, a standard reinforced constantly through magazines, advertisements, and a medical establishment that treated a slender figure as practically a moral virtue. A housewife who found Desoxyn helped her get through her chores, while also helping her fit into a dress a size smaller had, from the perspective of the era's cultural expectations, hit some kind of pharmaceutical jackpot. Never mind that the drug was quietly rewiring her sleep patterns, her mood regulation, and her relationship with hunger itself, in ways that would eventually demand a much steeper repayment. What makes this chapter particularly bleak in retrospect is how isolated these women often were in managing the drug's effects. There was no support network for discussing dependency, no framework for recognizing that the jitteriness, irritability, and creeping sleeplessness they experienced were symptoms of the very medication their doctor had assured them was safe. If a housewife confided to her physician that she felt anxious or couldn't sleep, the response was often simply an adjustment to her dosage rather than any reconsideration of whether the underlying treatment made sense at all. It's a bit like calling a mechanic because your car is making a strange noise and having them respond by turning up the radio. By the time the broader medical community began seriously questioning amphetamine prescribing practices, an entire generation of American women had already developed complicated, often invisible relationships with a drug marketed to them as a harmless helper. Their stories rarely made it into medical journals or historical accounts of the era, tucked away behind the era's polished, smiling advertisements. But their experience laid essential groundwork for understanding a pattern that would repeat itself, in slightly different form, across an entirely different segment of the population that had its own reasons for wanting a pill that promised to make the extra weight simply disappear. It's worth remembering that these women weren't naive or careless. They were operating entirely within the medical consensus of their era, trusting professionals who had every institutional incentive to reassure rather than caution them. The tragedy here isn't personal failure, it's structural, a healthcare system that offered a chemical shortcut instead of genuinely examining the conditions producing the exhaustion in the first place, and an entire generation of women who paid the physical and psychological cost of that shortcut quietly, largely without anyone outside their own households ever fully understanding what they were actually managing. Perhaps no use of Desoxyn was more widespread, or more revealing about mid-century medicine than its role as a diet pill, prescribed not as a last resort but as a first-line treatment for anyone who wanted to lose a few pounds before a wedding, a reunion, or simply out of vanity. The appetite-suppressing effects of methamphetamine had been well documented since the drug's earliest years, and by the 1950s, weight loss clinics across the country had essentially built entire business models around prescribing stimulants to patients who wanted to shed pounds without the tedious inconvenience of eating less or exercising more. Doctors running these clinics, sometimes derisively nicknamed fat doctors by the medical establishment that otherwise tolerated their practices, would prescribe Desoxyn or similar amphetamine cocktails with a casualness that would trigger a malpractice investigation today. Walk in, describe your weight concerns, walk out with a bottle of pharmaceutical methamphetamine and a follow-up appointment scheduled for whenever your prescription ran out. The appeal to patients is easy enough to understand, even if the medicine behind it was deeply flawed. Traditional dieting is slow, requires sustained willpower, and offers no guarantee of success. Desoxyn, by contrast, offered something that felt almost magical, a rapid suppression of appetite combined with a surge of energy that made the whole process feel less like deprivation and more like empowerment. Patients reported losing weight quickly, feeling more confident, and experiencing a burst of productivity that seemed to prove the pill was working exactly as advertised. It's the sort of result that looks fantastic in a before and after photo, and considerably less fantastic once you examine what's actually happening beneath the surface of that transformation. What these weight loss clinics rarely disclosed, whether from ignorance or willful omission, was that the appetite suppression came bundled with the same neurological and cardiovascular risks methamphetamine carries in any context. Patients experienced elevated heart rates, insomnia, anxiety, and the eventual development of tolerance, meaning the dose that once suppressed appetite effectively stopped working, prompting some doctors to simply increase it rather than reconsider the approach entirely. Some patients cycle through years of this pattern, chasing an ever-receding sense of the pill's original effectiveness, their bodies quietly accumulating the cardiovascular strain of sustained stimulant use in the name of fitting into a smaller dress size. There's a particular irony in how casually this entire industry treated what was, functionally, a drug being marketed for recreational adjacent purposes under a medical banner. If you handed someone methamphetamine on a street corner and told them it would help them lose weight and feel more energetic, everyone would immediately recognize the danger. Put that same drug in a labeled bottle, dispensed by a physician in a white coat, and suddenly it became simply another tool in the modern woman's beauty routine, no more remarkable than a girdle or a home perm kit. The medical legitimacy of the delivery method did nothing to change the chemistry, but it did an enormous amount to change public perception of the risk involved. By the time researchers and regulators began seriously scrutinizing these weight loss practices, the damage had already touched an enormous swathe of the population, women in particular, who had trusted their physicians and found themselves instead managing a dependency that had crept in disguised as a diet plan. And weight loss patients weren't the only demographic quietly building tolerance to a drug most of them didn't fully understand. An entirely different group, driven not by vanity but by the sheer demands of daily performance, was discovering Desoxyn's usefulness for reasons that had nothing to do with the bathroom scale. It's worth acknowledging how thoroughly this particular chapter foreshadowed later pharmaceutical controversies involving weight loss drugs, right down to the pattern of enthusiastic early marketing, followed by a much quieter, much later reckoning with cardiovascular risk and dependency. The specific molecule changes from era to era, but the underlying business model, sell a shortcut around difficult, unglamorous lifestyle change, has proven remarkably durable, resurfacing again and again in slightly different chemical packaging every few decades, each time greeted with the same enthusiastic amnesia about what happened the last time around. By the 1950s, Desoxyn and drugs like it had quietly become the chemical infrastructure behind a certain kind of American ambition, prescribed to truck drivers fighting sleep, students cramming for exams, and athletes looking for a competitive edge. The long-haul trucking industry in particular developed a reputation, deserved or not, for running substantially on amphetamines, and Desoxyn found its way into that world through the same channel as everything else in this story. A physician's willingness to prescribe it for a purpose that was, at best, only loosely medical. A trucker facing a multi-day cross-country route with tight delivery deadlines and mounting financial pressure to keep moving, had an obvious incentive to seek out something that could keep him alert through the small hours of the night. Truck stop diners across the country became informal distribution hubs for stimulants of varying legality, and a prescription bottle of Desoxyn carried the added benefit of looking entirely respectable if a state trooper happened to ask questions during a routine stop. College students discovered a similarly practical application. Cramming for final exams has never been a particularly restful experience, but methamphetamine offered a shortcut that felt, in the moment, like an academic superpower. Stay up all night, absorb an entire semester's worth of material in a single caffeinated, chemically enhanced haze, and walk into the exam room feeling sharp, focused, and entirely too confident about how well you actually understood any of it. The crash that followed the exam rarely made it into the anecdotes students shared with each other, mostly because by the time the crash arrived, the immediate crisis had passed, and the underlying costs simply got absorbed into whatever exhaustion already accompanies student life. Athletes, too, found their way to stimulants like Desoxyn, drawn by the promise of enhanced endurance, faster reaction times, and a competitive edge in an era before formal doping regulations existed in most sports. The line between legitimate medical treatment and performance enhancement was almost comically blurry during this period. A team physician prescribing amphetamines to help a player recover from fatigue wasn't operating in some shadowy grey market. He was simply practicing medicine as it was commonly understood at the time. It wasn't until later decades that sports organizations began seriously grappling with what constituted a fair chemical playing field. by which point amphetamine use in professional and amateur athletics alike had already become deeply, if quietly, entrenched. What unites all three of these groups, truckers, students, and athletes, is the way each treated the drug not as medicine in any traditional sense, but as a tool for extending human performance beyond its natural limits, a shortcut around the basic biological need for rest and recovery. There's something almost poignant about how universally appealing that promise turned out to be across such different walks of life. Whether you were hauling freight, studying for a chemistry final, or trying to make a college football roster, the pitch was fundamentally the same. This pill will let you do more than your body was designed to do, and it will make you feel great while you're doing it. The bill for that borrowed performance, as it always does, eventually came due in the form of dependency, cardiovascular strain, and psychological effects that took years to fully understand. But in the moment, none of that mattered nearly as much as the advertisements did, and those advertisements, glossy, confident, and almost entirely silent about consequences, were about to become some of the most fascinatingly misleading pharmaceutical marketing this country has ever produced. What's easy to miss in all this is how thoroughly these separate populations, truckers, students, and athletes, normalize stimulant use for each other simply by existing alongside one another in the broader culture. A student who watched an older sibling rely on stimulants to survive a demanding trucking route absorbed a lesson about acceptable chemical shortcuts long before ever picking up a textbook of their own. Cultural permission for this kind of use didn't arrive through any single announcement. It accumulated quietly, one borrowed pill and one shared story at a time, until it simply became part of the unspoken infrastructure of getting through an unreasonably demanding life. Flip through a 1950s medical journal, and you'll find full-page advertisements for Desoxyn that look less like pharmaceutical marketing and more like something out of a lifestyle magazine, glossy, aspirational, and almost entirely silent about the drug's actual chemical identity. These advertisements, aimed specifically at physicians rather than the general public, presented a version of medicine that feels almost surreal by modern, regulatory standards. Illustrations depicted smiling, energetic patients, often women, engaged in cheerful domestic or professional activities, radiating the kind of effortless vitality that the copy promised Desoxyn could deliver. The language leaned heavily on words like vigor, drive, and get up and go, carefully avoiding any direct acknowledgement that the active ingredient was chemically identical to a substance that, in a different context, would be treated as a serious controlled narcotic. It's the pharmaceutical equivalent of describing a tiger as a large, enthusiastic house cat. What's particularly striking about this marketing campaign is how it targeted physicians as gatekeepers rather than appealing directly to patients, a strategy that made a certain grim sense given the regulatory environment of the time. If you could convince a doctor that Desoxyn was a safe, effective, and clinically sound choice, that doctor would do the actual work of convincing the patient, lending the entire transaction an air of medical authority that a direct-to-consumer advertisement never could have achieved on its own. The advertisements frequently cited case studies and testimonials from physicians who had prescribed the drug successfully, creating a self-reinforcing ecosystem of professional endorsement that made skepticism feel almost unprofessional. Consider the specific claims these advertisements made without any apparent concern for eventual scrutiny. Desoxyn was described as producing a smooth, controlled elevation of mood, without the jitteriness associated with lesser stimulants, a claim that reads almost comically given what we now understand about methamphetamine's effects on the cardiovascular and nervous systems. It was marketed as appropriate for long-term use, with no meaningful discussion of tolerance or dependency, concepts that pharmaceutical marketing departments of the era treated as inconvenient footnotes rather than central safety concerns. If a modern advertisement made even a fraction of these claims about a Schedule II controlled substance, it would trigger an immediate and severe regulatory response. But in the 1950s, this was simply how the pharmaceutical business operated. The visual language of these campaigns deserves particular attention too. Advertisements often featured imagery associated with productivity and modern domestic success. A woman efficiently managing her household tasks with time to spare. A businessman closing deals with confident energy. A student acing an exam with a satisfied smile. None of the imagery hinted even slightly at the chemical reality underlying these idealized scenes. It was aspirational advertising dressed up in a white coat, selling not just a medication, but an entire lifestyle of effortless competence. A lifestyle that, as it turned out, came with an extremely steep and largely undisclosed interest rate. What makes this advertising history so uncomfortable in retrospect isn't just the misleading claims themselves, but how effectively they worked. Physicians, trusting the pharmaceutical companies whose products they'd prescribed for years without incident, absorbed this marketing largely without skepticism, and passed that confidence directly on to their patients. It created a closed loop of institutional trust that took years and mounting evidence of harm to finally break down. And as that trust began cracking in the coming years, an entirely different segment of American culture was already demonstrating, in far more public fashion, exactly what amphetamine dependency looked like when it played out under the bright lights of celebrity. It's genuinely worth imagining how differently the public might have responded had these advertisements simply included the word methamphetamine printed plainly on the page in the same font as the cheerful copy promising vigour and drive. The entire campaign depended on that particular omission, on allowing physicians and patients alike to engage with the drug's effects without ever confronting its actual chemical identity in plain language. Once that identity became impossible to obscure, decades later, the entire aspirational marketing apparatus collapsed almost overnight, unable to survive contact with a name the public had since learned to fear. Desoxyn didn't operate in a vacuum. It existed alongside a broader amphetamine culture that touched everyone from truck drivers to the biggest celebrities in America, and the story of how stimulant use became tangled up with fame, performance, and the pressure to never slow down says as much about the culture as it does about the chemistry. Elvis Presley's relationship with prescription stimulants has been documented extensively in the decades since his death, and while his specific medication regimen involved a rotating cast of amphetamines and other pharmaceuticals prescribed by a physician often criticized for his liberal prescribing habits, the broader pattern he represents is exactly what made drugs like Desoxyn so culturally embedded. Here was one of the most famous performers on the planet, maintaining a grueling schedule of concerts, recording sessions and public appearances that would exhaust anyone, relying on prescription stimulants to sustain a workload that had essentially become unsustainable through natural human energy alone. The entertainment industry of the mid-20th century operated on a punishing schedule that assumed performers could simply keep going, night after night, city after city, without adequate recovery time built into the equation. Studio executives and tour managers wanted product, wanted output, wanted the show to go on regardless of how depleted the human being at the center of it actually was. Amphetamines, methamphetamine included, offered a convenient solution to this scheduling problem, allowing performers to appear energetic, engaged, and camera-ready even when their actual physical state would otherwise have demanded rest. It's not so different from a modern executive relying on a steady stream of espresso to survive back-to-back meetings, except the pharmaceutical stakes here were considerably higher and the consequences considerably more severe. What made celebrity amphetamine use particularly influential wasn't just the drug's effect on the individual performers, but the way it normalized stimulant dependency as simply part of the cost of doing business at the highest levels of fame. If Elvis Presley could rely on prescription stimulants to maintain his career, and by all appearances continue to thrive, at least in the public eye, for years, then surely the risks being whispered about in medical circles were overblown, or at least manageable for anyone with sufficient willpower and access to a good doctor. This kind of celebrity-adjacent reasoning has a way of trickling down through culture regardless of how misleading it ultimately proves to be, and by the time the darker consequences of sustained amphetamine use became impossible to ignore, an entire generation had already absorbed the lesson that these drugs were simply tools of a demanding, glamorous lifestyle. The physicians who supplied these celebrities with their prescriptions occupied an uncomfortable and often ethically murky position, caught between their patients' genuine medical complaints, real or exaggerated, and the sheer commercial pressure surrounding careers worth enormous sums of money to record labels, studios, and management companies with a vested interest in keeping the show running. It created a system where the traditional doctor-patient relationship, already compromised by the era's loose amphetamine prescribing standards, became further distorted by fame, money, and the entertainment industry's insatiable appetite for continued output. By the time Elvis Presley died in 1977, with a toxicology report revealing an almost staggering cocktail of prescription medications in his system, the cultural conversation around celebrity drug use had already begun shifting, though methamphetamine specifically, wrapped in its Desoxyn packaging, still managed to fly comparatively under the radar compared to the sedatives and opioids that dominated headlines about his death. But behind the scenes, in doctors' offices and medical journals far from the glare of celebrity, a much quieter reckoning was beginning, as a small but growing number of physicians started noticing patterns in their own patients that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. It's worth remembering that Elvis wasn't an aberration within his industry. He was simply its most visible example. Countless other performers, athletes, and public figures of the era relied on similar pharmaceutical support to sustain schedules no human body was ever designed to maintain, and most of their stories never received the same posthumous scrutiny his did. His toxicology report became a cultural touchstone precisely because his fame demanded it. But the underlying pattern, chemically propped up performance treated as simply the cost of success, was quietly playing out in dressing rooms and locker rooms across the entire entertainment and sports landscape. By the late 1950s, a small but growing number of physicians began noticing something troubling in their patients: irritability, paranoia, dramatic weight loss beyond what anyone intended, and a dependency that looked less like medical treatment and more like something else entirely. These weren't fringe voices dismissing an otherwise successful medication out of unfounded caution. They were practicing physicians, some of whom had themselves prescribed Desoxyn and similar amphetamine products for years, watching their own patients develop symptoms that simply didn't fit the reassuring picture painted by pharmaceutical marketing. A patient originally prescribed the drug for mild fatigue would return months later, reporting sleeplessness that had spiraled into full insomnia, irritability that had curdled into genuine paranoia, and a physical appearance so gaunt from suppressed appetite that colleagues in the waiting room began asking concerned questions. It's the medical equivalent of noticing your car has been making an odd noise for months, and finally admitting that noise probably isn't going to fix itself. Case reports began trickling into medical journals describing what doctors termed amphetamine psychosis, a condition in which sustained high-dose use produced symptoms nearly indistinguishable from acute schizophrenia. Hallucinations, delusions of persecution, and a complete break from rational thought that, alarmingly, tended to resolve once the drug was discontinued, suggesting a direct causal relationship that was becoming increasingly difficult for the medical establishment to explain away as coincidence. For a drug that had spent over a decade being marketed as safe for long-term everyday use, this was a fairly damning development, the kind of finding that should have prompted immediate and sweeping reconsideration of prescribing practices. Yet institutional change moved with the particular sluggishness that seems to afflict any industry built around a profitable product. Pharmaceutical companies, understandably reluctant to abandon a lucrative revenue stream, pushed back against early critical research, funding counter-studies, and emphasizing that adverse effects occurred primarily in cases of misuse or excessive dosing, rather than acknowledging any fundamental problem with the drug's widespread casual prescription for conditions that had never warranted such a powerful intervention in the first place. It's a defense that sounds reasonable in isolation but becomes considerably less convincing once you consider just how loosely dosing guidelines had been enforced across the preceding decade. Some physicians, to their credit, began independently restricting their own prescribing practices well before any formal regulatory changes arrived, having witnessed enough patient deterioration firsthand to conclude that the risks simply weren't worth it for the relatively mild complaints Desoxyn was so often prescribed to treat. These early skeptics found themselves in an uncomfortable position, essentially arguing against a widely accepted standard of care within their own profession, armed with anecdotal observation rather than the kind of large-scale, longitudinal studies that would eventually confirm what they had already noticed in their own examination rooms. What's perhaps most telling about this period is how long it took for anecdotal physician concern to translate into any meaningful institutional response. The gap between doctors quietly noticing a problem and regulators actually acting on it stretched across most of a decade, a delay that allowed millions of additional prescriptions to be written for a drug whose risks were, by this point, becoming increasingly well documented among the very professionals responsible for dispensing it. And as those early warning signs accumulated in medical journals and hospital case files, an entirely separate and increasingly visible phenomenon was unfolding in the streets and back rooms of American cities, one that had far less patience for waiting on official channels to catch up. What's striking, reading these early case reports today, is how clinically restrained the language remains, even as the described symptoms grow increasingly alarming. Physicians writing in the cautious, hedge-everything style of medical journals described patients essentially losing touch with reality, then carefully noted that further study was warranted, a phrase that, in hindsight, feels almost comically understated, given what we now know was already unfolding in examination rooms across the country. Institutional caution, it turns out, moves at its own unhurried pace regardless of how urgent the underlying human cost has already become. The pharmaceutical industry had marketed Desoxyn as safe, controllable, and non-habit forming, but the bodies of the people taking it were beginning to tell a very different story, one involving tolerance that crept upward, withdrawal that crept in sideways, and a psychological grip that no one had adequately warned patients about. Tolerance, in pharmacological terms, describes the process by which a body adapts to a substance over time, requiring progressively larger doses to achieve the same original effect. For a drug marketed as a mild, controllable aid to energy and mood, this presented an obvious and deeply inconvenient problem. Patients who had started on a modest dose of Desoxyn for mild fatigue often found that same dose, 6 months or a year later, no longer produced any noticeable effect at all. The two paths forward from that point were equally unappealing: either increase the dosage and continue chasing the original sensation, or discontinue the drug entirely and confront a withdrawal process that pharmaceutical marketing had conveniently neglected to mention was even possible. Withdrawal from methamphetamine, even in its regulated Desoxyn form, produces a genuinely miserable constellation of symptoms: profound fatigue, depression that can feel considerably darker than whatever original complaint prompted the prescription in the first place, intense cravings, and a kind of mental fog that makes even basic daily functioning feel like wading through wet cement. Imagine spending months feeling artificially capable and energetic, only to discover that stopping the pill doesn't return you to your original baseline, but instead drops you into a deficit considerably worse than where you started. It's a bit like borrowing energy from a future version of yourself who, understandably, wants rather aggressive interest payments once the loan comes due. What made this particular cycle so insidious was how easily it could masquerade as ongoing legitimate medical need rather than dependency. A patient experiencing withdrawal-induced fatigue and depression would often return to their physician describing symptoms that sounded remarkably similar to the original complaint that had prompted the prescription, creating a self-perpetuating loop in which the treatment for the condition was also, quietly, the cause of its apparent return. Doctors, lacking a clear framework for distinguishing genuine relapse from withdrawal, frequently responded by simply renewing or increasing the prescription, unwittingly reinforcing a dependency they had no intention of creating. The psychological dimension of this dependency deserves particular attention too, separate from the purely physical mechanics of tolerance and withdrawal. Patients who had spent months or years relying on Desoxyn to feel capable, energetic, and emotionally stable often developed a genuine psychological reliance on the drug that went well beyond simple habit. The idea of functioning without it became genuinely frightening, not because of any rational assessment of the drug's actual necessity, but because the felt experience of stopping was so viscerally unpleasant that continuing simply felt like the only reasonable option. This is precisely the mechanism that makes any addictive substance so difficult to walk away from, regardless of whether it arrived via prescription pad or street corner. By the time this pattern had become widely recognized within the medical community, an enormous number of patients across the country had already developed some version of this dependency, often without any clear understanding of what was actually happening to them. They weren't reckless drug users chasing an illicit high. They were ordinary people who had trusted their doctors, taken their medication exactly as prescribed, and found themselves trapped in a cycle that the drug's original marketing had assured them was simply impossible. And while this quiet, respectable dependency was unfolding in doctors' offices across the country, a much louder and more visible version of methamphetamine culture was simultaneously taking shape in a completely different corner of American life. There's a particular cruelty embedded in this cycle worth naming directly. Patients weren't failing to follow medical advice. They were following it precisely, and the advice itself was quietly generating the very problem it claimed to solve. It's difficult to overstate how disorienting that must have felt from the inside, doing everything correctly according to your trusted physician, and still watching your own baseline capacity for rest, mood, and stability steadily erode beneath you, with no clear villain to blame except a molecule everyone involved had been assured was safe. By the 1960s, a subculture had formed entirely around injectable methamphetamine, and while much of it operated far outside any pharmacy counter, the drug's medical respectability under names like Desoxyn made it easier for this subculture to source, justify, and normalize its use. The term speed freak entered the American vocabulary during this decade, describing a growing population of users who had moved beyond the tablet form familiar to Desoxyn patients, and discovered that injecting the drug intravenously produced a dramatically more intense and immediate effect. This wasn't necessarily an entirely separate population from the medically prescribed users discussed in earlier segments. The lines between legitimate patient and recreational enthusiast blurred considerably once a drug this potent entered wider circulation, and some of the earliest injectable methamphetamine users had, in fact, started their relationship with the substance through a perfectly legal prescription before discovering that the tablets could be dissolved, filtered, and delivered in a form the pharmaceutical company had never intended or endorsed. San Francisco in particular became closely associated with this emerging speed culture, with certain physicians in the city developing reputations for writing methamphetamine prescriptions with minimal scrutiny, creating an informal pipeline that supplied both genuine patients and a growing population of recreational users who had figured out exactly which doctors would ask the fewest questions. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the strange continuity running through this entire story. The same casual prescribing practices that had defined Desoxyn's mainstream medical use throughout the 1940s and 50s were now, in a slightly different context, fueling an entirely new subculture built around the drug's more intense recreational applications. The speed freak lifestyle that emerged from this environment carried its own distinct culture, aesthetic, and vocabulary, one that diverged sharply from the buttoned-up, pharmaceutically sanctioned world of housewives and truck drivers discussed earlier in this story. Users described marathon sessions lasting days, during which ordinary tasks like cleaning or organizing became consumed with an obsessive, repetitive intensity that observers at the time found both fascinating and deeply unsettling. This behavior, now well documented in addiction literature as a hallmark symptom of methamphetamine intoxication, wasn't yet fully understood by the medical or cultural mainstream, who simply observed a population of increasingly gaunt, sleep-deprived individuals engaged in bizarre, hyper-focused activity and struggled to categorize exactly what they were witnessing. What's particularly notable about this period is how directly it began generating public alarm in a way that decades of quiet housewife dependency simply hadn't. A middle-aged woman quietly taking Desoxyn tablets prescribed by her family doctor didn't generate headlines or public concern. She was simply managing her nerves as the culture of the time understood it. But visible speed freak culture, with its associated crime, erratic public behavior, and increasingly documented cases of amphetamine psychosis playing out in public view, was considerably harder to ignore or explain away, and it began attracting exactly the kind of journalistic and law enforcement attention that pharmaceutical companies had spent 2 decades successfully avoiding. The emergence of this visible, disruptive subculture created an uncomfortable public relations problem for a drug that was, at that very moment, still being prescribed by respectable physicians to ordinary patients across the country. It became increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that methamphetamine was simply a mild, controllable medical treatment when a widely publicized and visibly troubled population of users was demonstrating in real time exactly what happened when that same chemical was pushed to its more intense recreational extreme. And it was this growing public alarm, rather than the quieter, better documented concerns of individual physicians, that would finally push the issue onto the desks of federal lawmakers, who were about to take a considerably closer look at exactly how loosely stimulants like Desoxyn had been regulated for the better part of 3 decades. What's easy to overlook, watching this subculture take shape from a comfortable historical distance, is how thin the line actually was between the speed freak and the housewife 2 towns over, quietly managing her own tablet-based dependency with her physician's full blessing. Both were chasing essentially the same chemical relief from essentially the same underlying exhaustion with modern life's demands. One simply did it with a needle and a reputation, the other with a prescription pad and a level of social respectability the drug itself had done nothing to actually earn. As reports of amphetamine abuse mounted through the 1960s, congressional hearings began examining just how loosely stimulants like Desoxyn were being prescribed, and the testimony that emerged painted a picture of an industry that had been remarkably casual about handing out a drug now understood to carry serious addictive potential. These hearings, convened under increasing pressure from public health officials, journalists, and a growing body of medical research documenting amphetamine dependency, dragged pharmaceutical company representatives, physicians, and addiction researchers into the same room to testify about practices that had, until quite recently, been considered entirely unremarkable. The testimony revealed statistics that seem almost fictional in their sheer scale. Production figures suggesting that American pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing enough amphetamine-class stimulants, Desoxyn included, to supply every single adult in the country with dozens of doses annually, an amount that bore no plausible relationship to legitimate medical need, no matter how generously one interpreted the diagnostic criteria of the era. Committee members expressed particular alarm at how easily these prescriptions had circulated with minimal oversight, describing a system in which patients could visit multiple physicians for the same complaint, accumulating prescriptions that no centralized database existed to catch or flag. It's a regulatory gap that seems almost quaint compared to the sophisticated prescription monitoring systems that exist today, but at the time, it represented a genuinely gaping hole in the country's ability to track how a powerful, addictive substance was actually being distributed and consumed across the population. Pharmaceutical industry representatives, called to defend their marketing and distribution practices, generally offered a version of the argument that had sustained the industry for 2 decades, that the drug itself was safe when used as directed, and that any problems arising from misuse reflected patient or prescriber error rather than any fundamental flaw in the product itself. This defense, familiar to anyone who has followed subsequent pharmaceutical controversies involving other classes of addictive medications, drew increasing skepticism from committee members who had, by this point, reviewed enough case studies of dependency developing in patients who had followed their prescriptions exactly as directed to find the argument considerably less persuasive than it might have sounded a decade earlier. Physicians who testified offered a more mixed picture, some defending their prescribing practices as reasonable, given the medical understanding available at the time, others candidly acknowledging that the profession had been far too casual in handing out a drug whose addictive potential simply hadn't been adequately studied or communicated before it entered widespread use. This kind of institutional self-reflection, rare enough in any professional context, at least suggested that the medical community was beginning to genuinely grapple with its role in creating a public health problem that extended well beyond the visible speed freak subculture capturing headlines at the time. What emerged from these hearings wasn't an immediate ban or even a dramatic overnight change in prescribing practices, but rather the foundational groundwork for a much more significant regulatory overhaul that would arrive within the following few years. Lawmakers began drafting legislation intended to create the kind of comprehensive drug scheduling system the country had never previously possessed, one that would categorize substances according to their medical usefulness, balanced against their potential for abuse and dependency. Desoxyn, along with the entire class of amphetamines it belonged to, was about to be swept up in this new regulatory framework, a shift that would fundamentally alter the drug's legal status and, in the process, permanently change the casual relationship American medicine had maintained with methamphetamine for nearly 3 decades. What these hearings ultimately revealed, beneath all the statistics and testimony, was an institutional failure of imagination as much as an institutional failure of oversight. Nobody involved, not the pharmaceutical companies, not the prescribing physicians, not the regulatory bodies theoretically watching over all of it, had seriously asked what happens when you make a genuinely addictive substance this easy to obtain for this long. The answer, once finally examined under the harsh light of congressional scrutiny, turned out to be exactly what basic pharmacological caution would have predicted all along, had anyone bothered to ask the question sooner. When the United States passed the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, methamphetamine was placed into Schedule II, a category reserved for drugs with recognized medical use, but also a high potential for abuse. And Desoxyn suddenly found itself wearing a very different legal identity than it had worn for the previous 3 decades. This legislative overhaul represented the most significant regulatory response yet to the mounting evidence of amphetamine misuse that had accumulated throughout the preceding decade. The Controlled Substances Act established a tiered system, organizing drugs according to their medical utility and abuse potential, with Schedule I reserved for substances deemed to have no accepted medical use whatsoever, and Schedule II designated for drugs that, despite carrying serious risks of dependency, retained recognized therapeutic applications significant enough to justify continued, if heavily restricted, medical availability. Methamphetamine's placement in this second category acknowledged something that pharmaceutical marketing had spent decades trying to obscure. This was, unambiguously, a drug with serious abuse potential, deserving of the same careful institutional handling as other powerful and addictive medications. The practical consequences of this reclassification were immediate and far-reaching. Prescriptions for Schedule II substances could no longer be called in by phone or casually refill the way earlier amphetamine prescriptions often had been. Physicians were required to write new prescriptions for each refill, subject to specific documentation requirements designed to create exactly the kind of paper trail that had been so conspicuously absent during the earlier decades of casual prescribing. Pharmacies faced new storage and inventory requirements, treating methamphetamine with the same security protocols applied to other high-risk controlled substances, a stark departure from the era when Desoxyn had sat on shelves with roughly the same level of oversight as cold medicine. For physicians who had built certain aspects of their practice around casual amphetamine prescribing, whether for weight loss, mild depression, or general fatigue, this new regulatory environment represented a significant disruption to business as usual. The relatively effortless process of writing a Desoxyn prescription for a patient complaining of tiredness had been replaced by a system demanding careful justification, extensive documentation, and an implicit acknowledgement that this particular medication now carried a legal and professional weight it simply hadn't carried before. Many physicians, faced with this new administrative burden, simply stopped prescribing it altogether, redirecting patients toward alternative treatments that didn't require navigating the same regulatory hurdles. This shift also fundamentally altered the pharmaceutical industry's relationship with the drug. Abbott Laboratories, having built a profitable product around a molecule now legally classified alongside some of the most tightly restricted medications in the country, found the commercial appeal of Desoxyn considerably diminished. The advertising campaigns that had once filled medical journals with cheerful, energetic imagery quietly disappeared, replaced by a much more restrained clinical presentation, appropriate to a drug that regulators, and increasingly the medical community itself, now viewed with considerable caution rather than casual enthusiasm. It's worth pausing to appreciate the strange symmetry of this moment. The same molecule that had spent 3 decades marketed as a harmless aid to energy, weight loss, and mild nervous complaints was now legally acknowledged as carrying risks serious enough to warrant the same regulatory category as morphine and other powerful, tightly controlled medications. The chemistry hadn't changed even slightly during those 30 years. What had changed was the accumulated weight of evidence, patient harm, and public alarm that had finally forced institutions to catch up with a reality that individual patients and increasingly skeptical physicians had been quietly living for years. But for the patients still legitimately relying on Desoxyn for genuine medical conditions, this new legal framework introduced a whole new set of everyday complications that hadn't existed even a year earlier. It's worth noting how differently this story might have unfolded had this kind of scheduling framework existed from the drug's earliest American introduction back in the 1940s. An entire generation of patients might have been spared the slow, invisible slide into dependency that so many experienced under the previous, considerably looser regulatory regime. Regulation arriving late doesn't erase the harm accumulated in its absence. It simply marks the point at which institutions finally, belatedly, caught up with a reality that individual bodies had already been quietly absorbing for decades. The reclassification of methamphetamine didn't make Desoxyn disappear, but it fundamentally changed the experience of obtaining it, wrapping the prescription in layers of restriction, documentation, and suspicion that hadn't existed when your grandmother's doctor handed her a bottle for her nerves. Patients who had relied on Desoxyn for years, some for legitimate ongoing medical conditions that genuinely responded to the medication, suddenly found themselves navigating a bureaucratic obstacle course that hadn't existed even a year earlier. Monthly refills that had once been a routine phone call to the pharmacy now required an in-person visit to the physician's office, a new handwritten prescription each time, and often an uncomfortable conversation justifying continued need for a medication that had, in the public imagination, become increasingly associated with the visible drug crisis playing out in headlines and congressional hearings. Imagine having taken the same medication reliably for a decade, only to suddenly find yourself treated with the same wary scrutiny typically reserved for someone attempting to obtain a controlled narcotic under questionable pretenses, because legally speaking, that's now precisely the category your medication occupied. Pharmacies too adjusted their practices considerably. Schedule II medications required secure, separate storage, careful inventory tracking, and reporting requirements designed to catch any suspicious patterns of distribution that might indicate diversion into illegal markets. Many smaller pharmacies, weighing the regulatory burden against the relatively modest profit margin on a drug increasingly prescribed to a shrinking patient population, simply decided against stocking Desoxyn at all, a decision that left legitimate patients in certain areas struggling to even locate a pharmacy willing to fill their prescription. It's the pharmaceutical equivalent of a restaurant deciding a particular dish, however occasionally requested, simply isn't worth the health inspector's extra scrutiny. Insurance companies, navigating this same shifting landscape, began applying increased scrutiny to methamphetamine prescriptions as well, sometimes requiring prior authorization or additional documentation before agreeing to cover the medication, adding yet another administrative hurdle for patients who, in many cases, had done nothing more than continue taking a medication their doctor had originally prescribed years earlier under an entirely different regulatory regime. The cumulative effect of all these individually modest bureaucratic changes was a medication that had become, functionally, far more difficult to access, regardless of whether the underlying medical justification for its use had changed even slightly. There was also a distinct psychological and social shift accompanying these regulatory changes. Patients who had never thought twice about mentioning their Desoxyn prescription in casual conversation, the way one might mention any other routine medication, suddenly found themselves more reluctant to disclose it, aware that public perception of methamphetamine had shifted dramatically, even if their own medical circumstances hadn't changed at all. There's a particular kind of quiet indignity in watching a medication you've taken responsibly for years become, almost overnight, a source of social stigma and bureaucratic suspicion, through no fault of your own and no change in your actual treatment. Physicians, meanwhile, face their own version of this reputational shift. Prescribing a schedule. Two methamphetamine products now invited a level of scrutiny from medical boards and regulatory bodies that simply hadn't existed during the freewheeling decades of casual amphetamine prescribing. Many doctors, weighing this increased professional risk against the relatively narrow range of conditions for which Desoxyn remained genuinely indicated, quietly stopped prescribing it altogether, redirecting patients toward newer, less stigmatized stimulant medications that were beginning to enter the market. This gradual physician exodus from Desoxyn prescribing set the stage for the drug's slow retreat into an increasingly narrow corner of American medicine, even as, somewhat ironically, an entirely separate and vastly larger methamphetamine economy was beginning to flourish completely outside the reach of any pharmacy counter or physician's prescription pad. There's a particular kind of institutional whiplash embedded in this transition worth sitting with. Patients hadn't changed. Their underlying medical conditions, whatever legitimate need had originally prompted their prescription, remained exactly the same the day after the new regulations took effect as they had been the day before. What changed was entirely external, a shift in legal classification that transformed an unremarkable errand into a recurring bureaucratic negotiation, through no fault or choice of the people actually living with the condition the medication was meant to treat. While Desoxyn continued its narrow legal existence in pharmacies, an entirely separate and much larger methamphetamine economy was taking shape in illegal laboratories, one that owed its chemistry, and in some ways its cultural permission, to the drug's decades of legitimate medical use. The basic synthesis of methamphetamine isn't a particularly novel or complicated chemical process, at least not by the standards of organized clandestine chemistry, and the widespread medical use of the drug throughout the preceding decades meant that detailed information about its molecular structure and synthesis pathway had been openly published in pharmaceutical literature for years. Individuals interested in manufacturing the drug outside legitimate channels didn't need to reverse engineer some closely guarded pharmaceutical secret. They needed access to precursor chemicals and a working knowledge of organic chemistry that, thanks to decades of legitimate scientific publication, wasn't particularly difficult to acquire for anyone sufficiently motivated to look for it. This underground manufacturing world developed with remarkable speed once the legal pharmaceutical pathway to methamphetamine began tightening under the new Schedule II restrictions. If a drug that had once been available with a relatively casual prescription suddenly required navigating an increasingly restrictive medical bureaucracy, an obvious market opportunity emerged for anyone willing to manufacture and distribute the same chemical compound outside that system entirely. The demand hadn't disappeared simply because Congress had reclassified the drug. If anything, decades of legitimate medical use had already normalized the substance's effects for a huge segment of the population who now found their previously simple access route considerably more complicated. What's particularly notable about this transition is how directly it traces back to the same molecule, the same chemistry, and in some cases the same population of users who had first encountered methamphetamine through entirely legitimate medical channels. A patient who had spent years taking Desoxyn under a physician's supervision, only to find that supervision increasingly difficult to maintain under the new regulatory environment, represented a ready-made customer for whatever illegal alternative emerged to fill that gap. It's a pattern that would repeat itself decades later with an entirely different class of drugs, when prescription opioid patients found their legal supply restricted and turned to illegal alternatives that were, in some tragic cases, considerably more dangerous than the original medication had been. Early clandestine methamphetamine production in this period tended to be small-scale and localized. lacking the sophisticated distribution networks that would characterize later decades of the illegal meth trade. But the fundamental groundwork was being laid during this transitional period. The chemistry was understood, the demand existed, and the legal pathway to satisfying that demand had just become considerably more restrictive. Anyone looking to build an illegal manufacturing operation in this environment wasn't starting from scratch. They were essentially picking up a chemical process that pharmaceutical companies had already spent 30 years perfecting, packaging, and distributing at massive scale. This period represents a genuinely important inflection point in the broader history of methamphetamine in America, the moment when the drug's identity began splitting into two increasingly distinct paths that would diverge dramatically over the following decades. One path led toward an increasingly narrow, tightly regulated corner of legitimate medicine, still bearing the Desoxyn name and still, technically, entirely legal. The other path led toward an illegal manufacturing and distribution economy that would eventually grow into one of the most significant drug crises in American history, complete with its own geography, its own culture, and its own devastating human toll. And it was on the American West Coast, among a particular subculture already comfortable operating outside conventional legal and social structures, that this illegal path first began to take organized, recognizable shape. It's worth considering how directly this underground manufacturing boom traces back to decades of casual pharmaceutical publication, back when nobody imagined that openly documenting a drug synthesis pathway in a medical journal might someday hand a blueprint to operators with considerably less benign intentions than advancing legitimate clinical knowledge. Information, once released into the world, doesn't remain neatly contained within its original intended audience. A lesson the pharmaceutical industry would learn the hard way, as its own scientific transparency became raw material for an entirely different, considerably darker economy. Long before rural meth labs became a Midwestern epidemic, outlaw motorcycle clubs on the American West Coast had already identified methamphetamine as a reliable, relatively simple product to manufacture and distribute, building a supply chain that operated in the shadow of the same drug still sitting on pharmacy shelves. Outlaw motorcycle clubs, already operating outside conventional legal and social structures throughout the 1960s and 70s, found methamphetamine production a natural fit for their existing organizational capabilities. These groups already possessed established networks for moving goods across regions, a cultural comfort with operating beyond the reach of law enforcement, and members with the kind of practical, hands-on technical skills that clandestine chemistry, however dangerous, actually requires. It's not so different from any other underground industry finding its natural early adopters among populations already comfortable with risk and already possessing the infrastructure needed to move product discreetly. The methamphetamine produced through these early biker-operated laboratories tended to be considerably less pure and less consistent than the pharmaceutical-grade Desoxyn still available through legitimate channels, but it offered something the legal product increasingly couldn't: easy, unrestricted access without the bureaucratic hurdles that had come to define Schedule II prescribing. A user who might once have obtained methamphetamine through a physician's prescription now had an entirely separate, if considerably rougher, supply chain available, one that asked no questions about medical necessity and required no uncomfortable conversation about tapering dosages or documenting continued need. These early operations were, by later standards, fairly modest in scale, typically small laboratories capable of producing enough product to supply regional distribution networks, rather than the massive industrial operations that would eventually characterize later decades of the trade. But they established crucial infrastructure and knowledge that would be built upon by subsequent generations of illegal manufacturers, creating a kind of underground apprenticeship system where synthesis techniques, precursor sourcing strategies and distribution methods were passed along and refined within these tightly knit criminal organizations. What's worth noting here is how this illegal manufacturing culture existed in a strange, almost parallel relationship to the legitimate pharmaceutical industry that had, decades earlier, done so much to normalize methamphetamine as an acceptable substance in the first place. The outlaw motorcycle clubs cooking meth in makeshift laboratories weren't operating in some completely separate cultural universe from the physicians who had, not so many years earlier, prescribed the same chemical compound for weight loss and mild fatigue. Both were, in their own very different ways, responding to the same underlying demand for a stimulant that made users feel energetic, confident, and capable, a demand that decades of legitimate pharmaceutical marketing had done an enormous amount to cultivate and normalize across broad segments of American society. Law enforcement attention to this emerging trade grew steadily throughout the 1970s, as authorities began recognizing methamphetamine manufacturing and distribution as a distinct criminal enterprise deserving of dedicated investigative resources rather than simply an extension of existing biker gang criminal activity. Raids on clandestine laboratories became increasingly common, revealing to the public a chemical manufacturing process considerably more visible, dangerous, and toxic than anything the pharmaceutical industry's clean, regulated production facilities had ever displayed. Toxic fumes, chemical burns, and the sheer environmental devastation left behind by improperly disposed manufacturing waste introduced an entirely new dimension of public health concern that had never been part of the conversation during Desoxyn's mainstream medical heyday. This growing, increasingly visible illegal trade would only continue to expand over the following decades, eventually eclipsing the legitimate pharmaceutical market so thoroughly that most Americans would come to think of methamphetamine exclusively as a street drug, entirely forgetting or never knowing in the first place that a small legal version had continued quietly existing this entire time. There's an uncomfortable continuity worth naming plainly here. The same demand that pharmaceutical marketing had spent 3 decades carefully cultivating didn't simply vanish once Schedule II restrictions made the legal product hard to obtain. It simply migrated toward whoever was willing to meet it outside the newly tightened legal channel. Outlaw motorcycle clubs didn't create the appetite for methamphetamine in America. They inherited it, fully formed, from an industry that had spent decades teaching an entire population to associate this particular molecule with energy, confidence, and effortless capability. Through the 1980s and 90s, as methamphetamine's public reputation curdled into something associated almost exclusively with addiction, poverty, and crime, Desoxyn's legitimate prescribing base shrank into a small, specific corner of medicine that most Americans had no idea still existed. The cultural distance between pharmaceutical Desoxyn and street methamphetamine widened dramatically during these decades, even though the two substances remained, at a molecular level, functionally identical. Media coverage throughout this period focused overwhelmingly on the illegal manufacturing and distribution side of the methamphetamine story, documenting the toxic laboratory raids, the devastating physical toll of chronic use, and the crime associated with an increasingly organized illegal trade. This coverage, while accurately depicting a genuine and serious public health crisis, almost never mentioned that a small legal pharmaceutical version of the exact same drug continued to exist, quietly, in pharmacies across the country, prescribed to a shrinking population of patients for reasons that had nothing to do with the crisis dominating headlines. This created a peculiar cultural disconnect that persists in many ways to this day. If you'd stopped the average American on the street during this period and asked whether methamphetamine had any legitimate medical uses, the overwhelming majority would have confidently answered no, entirely unaware that a Schedule II pharmaceutical product bearing exactly that chemical identity was still being manufactured, prescribed, and dispensed through entirely legal channels. The pharmaceutical industry, for its part, had little incentive to draw attention to this awkward continuity, quietly maintaining Desoxyn's narrow presence in the market without any of the aggressive advertising campaigns that had once filled medical journals with cheerful, energetic imagery. The patient population still legitimately using Desoxyn during this period had narrowed considerably from its mid-century heyday of housewives, students, and truck drivers. What remained was a much smaller group of patients with specific, well-documented medical conditions, for which alternative treatments had proven insufficient. Individuals whose physicians had determined, after careful consideration, that the benefits of methamphetamine treatment genuinely outweighed the risks and stigma now attached to the medication. These patients often found themselves in the strange position of managing a legitimate, physician-supervised medical treatment, while simultaneously navigating a cultural landscape that treated their medication as synonymous with one of the most devastating drug crises in American history. Physicians who continued prescribing Desoxyn during this era did so with considerably more caution and documentation than their 1950s counterparts, well aware that any suggestion of loose or inappropriate prescribing would invite exactly the kind of regulatory and professional scrutiny that had already claimed the reputations of physicians associated with looser eras of amphetamine distribution. This more careful, conservative approach to prescribing likely served patients better in the long run, even as it made the medication considerably harder to access for anyone whose medical need fell into any kind of grey area. By the end of the 1990s, Desoxyn existed as something close to a medical curiosity, a legal pharmaceutical footnote sitting quietly alongside a massive culturally dominant narrative about methamphetamine as an illegal, destructive street drug. The company that had once marketed it with glossy, aspirational advertisements had long since scaled back any promotional efforts, content to let the medication continue serving its narrow remaining patient population without drawing unnecessary attention to a product whose brand name increasingly sounded, to anyone paying close attention, uncomfortably similar to a drug regularly featured in news reports about addiction and crime. And it was into this narrow, quiet, remaining niche that a new generation of patients and a new diagnostic category entirely would eventually arrive. It's worth pausing on the strange psychological experience of the patients caught in the middle of this cultural shift. People who had never touched an illegal drug in their lives, taking a medication their own physician had prescribed, while an entire national conversation raged around them, treating that same chemical as synonymous with criminality and ruin. They weren't confused about their own circumstances. They simply had to live inside a widening gap between their lived medical reality and a cultural narrative that had, quite understandably, stopped making any room for nuance. Today, if Desoxyn is prescribed at all, it's most often for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, in patients who haven't responded to other stimulant medications, a use case that sounds almost quaint compared to its 1950s heyday as an all-purpose PEP pill. The modern medical understanding of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, developed and refined over the decades following Desoxyn's regulatory reclassification, represents one of the few contexts in which methamphetamine's specific pharmacological properties, its ability to increase focus, sustain attention, and moderate impulsivity, align with an actual well-documented clinical condition rather than the vague catch-all complaints that once justified its widespread mid-century prescription. Physicians prescribing Desoxyn for ADHD today typically do so only after other, less potent stimulant medications, such as those built around amphetamine or methylphenidate, have failed to produce adequate symptom control, positioning the drug as something closer to a last resort than a first-line treatment. This narrow, carefully considered application represents a genuinely dramatic departure from the drug's historical prescribing pattern, and the contrast is worth sitting with for a moment. The same chemical compound once handed out for vague nervous complaints, mild depression, and simple weight management is now reserved for a specific neurodevelopmental condition, prescribed only after careful diagnostic evaluation, and typically only when other treatment options have already been exhausted. It's a genuinely responsible approach to prescribing, the kind of careful, evidence-based practice that simply didn't exist during the drug's earlier, far more casual decades of use. Though it's worth noting that this responsible approach arrived only after decades of documented harm forced the medical establishment to fundamentally reconsider its relationship with the medication. Patients prescribed Desoxyn for ADHD today typically undergo considerably more rigorous monitoring than their 1950s counterparts ever experienced, including regular cardiovascular assessments, careful dosage titration, and ongoing evaluation of whether the medication's benefits continue to outweigh its risks. This kind of structured, cautious medical supervision stands in stark contrast to the era when a patient could walk into a doctor's office complaining of vague tiredness and walk out with a prescription requiring no meaningful follow-up whatsoever. The regulatory and professional infrastructure surrounding methamphetamine prescribing has, in this narrow sense, genuinely matured over the intervening decades, even if that maturation arrived at considerable human cost. What makes this modern ADHD application particularly interesting is how it reveals something important about the underlying pharmacology that got lost amid decades of both overzealous mid-century marketing and later cultural stigma. Methamphetamine, at an appropriately controlled dose, does produce genuine, measurable improvements in attention and impulse control for individuals with legitimate ADHD, a fact that remains true regardless of the drug's complicated cultural history or its unfortunate chemical kinship with a substance responsible for enormous documented harm when manufactured and consumed outside any medical framework. The molecule itself doesn't carry moral baggage. It simply produces predictable physiological effects that can be genuinely therapeutic in the right clinical context and genuinely devastating in the wrong one. Despite this legitimate, carefully considered modern application, Desoxyn remains one of the least commonly prescribed medications in its therapeutic category, with most physicians and patients alike gravitating toward alternative stimulant medications that carry less cultural baggage and, frankly, less bureaucratic hassle. The drug's continued presence in the modern pharmaceutical landscape exists almost as a specialized tool, reserved for a narrow subset of patients for whom other options simply haven't worked, prescribed by physicians willing to navigate the considerable administrative and reputational complexity that still surrounds any methamphetamine prescription, regardless of how legitimate or carefully considered that prescription might be. There's a certain quiet vindication buried in this modern chapter, worth acknowledging directly. For a molecule that spent decades being either wildly overprescribed or reflexively feared, depending on the decade, finding even one narrow, well-evidenced application where its specific properties genuinely help a specific population represents a small but meaningful correction. It doesn't erase the earlier decades of harm, and it certainly doesn't rehabilitate the drug's broader cultural reputation, but it does suggest that somewhere underneath all that history, there was always a legitimate pharmacological signal buried in the noise. Ask a modern pharmacist about filling a Desoxyn prescription, and you'll likely get a slightly raised eyebrow, because stocking a Schedule 2 methamphetamine product invites a level of regulatory scrutiny, security requirements, and sheer paperwork that many pharmacies simply decide isn't worth the trouble. Modern pharmacy operations, particularly the large chain pharmacies that dominate the American retail landscape, operate on carefully calculated cost-benefit analyses regarding which medications to stock, weighing factors like patient demand, storage requirements, insurance reimbursement rates, and regulatory compliance burden. A medication like Desoxyn, prescribed to a vanishingly small patient population and requiring the same rigorous security protocols and inventory tracking as far more commonly prescribed controlled substances, often fails this calculation rather dramatically. Why maintain the specialized secure storage, detailed record keeping, and enhanced theft prevention measures required for a Schedule II product when the medication in question might be prescribed only a handful of times per year across an entire pharmacy's patient base? This practical reality creates genuine hardship for the small number of patients whose legitimate medical treatment depends on continued access to the medication. Patients report calling multiple pharmacies across their region before finding one willing to stock and fill their prescription, a frustrating and time-consuming process that adds an entirely unnecessary layer of difficulty to managing an already complex medical condition. It's the pharmaceutical equivalent of needing a very specific, rarely stocked hardware store item and discovering that half the stores in town have simply decided it's not worth their shelf space, leaving you to drive considerably further than you'd like for something that should, in theory, be a routine purchase. Pharmacists who do choose to stock Desoxyn describe a genuinely elevated administrative burden compared to more commonly dispensed medications. Every transaction requires careful documentation, adherence to strict security protocols during storage and dispensing, and heightened vigilance against the kind of prescription fraud or diversion attempts that any Schedule II controlled substance inevitably attracts, precisely because its street value and abuse potential remain exactly as significant as they were when Congress first classified it that way back in 1970. This isn't paranoia on the part of individual pharmacists. It reflects a genuine, documented pattern of Schedule II medications attracting disproportionate attention from anyone looking to divert legitimate pharmaceutical products into illegal markets. The insurance and regulatory landscape surrounding Desoxyn prescriptions adds yet another layer of friction to this already complicated picture. Insurance companies frequently require prior authorization before covering the medication, demanding extensive documentation of failed alternative treatments and ongoing medical necessity, a bureaucratic process that can take weeks to resolve and leaves patients without medication in the interim. For a drug whose therapeutic effect depends on consistent, uninterrupted dosing, these gaps in access created by insurance and pharmacy availability issues aren't merely inconvenient. They can genuinely undermine the treatment's effectiveness, creating exactly the kind of stop-start dosing pattern that responsible prescribing practices are specifically designed to avoid. There's a certain dark irony embedded in this modern pharmacy landscape, one worth sitting with for a moment. The very regulatory framework put in place decades ago specifically to prevent the kind of casual, widespread distribution that characterized Desoxyn's mid-century heyday has now made the medication so administratively burdensome that legitimate patients with genuine medical need frequently struggle to access it at all. The pendulum swung, understandably and necessarily, from wildly permissive to appropriately cautious, but it may have swung far enough that a small population of patients with legitimate, carefully diagnosed medical conditions now find themselves collateral casualties of a regulatory system designed to address a problem that, in their specific case, never actually applied to them. And layered on top of all this practical bureaucratic difficulty sits something even harder to navigate: the simple, persistent social stigma of taking a medication whose chemical name most people recognize primarily from news reports about addiction. It's worth imagining this scenario from the patient's side of the counter, standing there while a pharmacist apologetically explains that they simply don't stock this particular medication and can't say for certain who in the area might. For a condition that already carries its own daily challenges around organisation and follow-through, adding a scavenger hunt for a pharmacy willing to fill a routine prescription represents exactly the kind of unnecessary friction that responsible medical policy should probably be working hard to eliminate. There's a particular kind of cognitive dissonance in telling someone their medication is chemically identical to a substance associated with some of the most devastating addiction stories in modern America, and patients prescribed Desoxyn today often carry a stigma that has little to do with their actual treatment. Consider what it must feel like to explain your medical treatment to a new acquaintance, a co-worker, or even a family member unfamiliar with your specific diagnosis, and to watch their expression shift the moment you mention the word methamphetamine, regardless of how carefully you explain the pharmaceutical, physician-supervised context in which you're taking it. The cultural weight attached to that word, built up over decades of news coverage about addiction, crime, and devastating personal loss, doesn't simply disappear because your particular relationship with the chemical happens to be entirely legal, carefully monitored, and genuinely therapeutic. It's a bit like trying to explain that the wolf standing calmly on a leash in your living room is, in this specific instance, a friendly and well-trained service animal, while the person you're talking to remains understandably fixated on the fact that it is, undeniably, a wolf. This stigma manifests in genuinely practical ways beyond simple social awkwardness. Patients report reluctance from certain employers or even romantic partners upon learning about their prescription, an uncomfortable reality for individuals managing a legitimate medical condition through appropriately supervised treatment. Some patients describe deliberately avoiding mentioning their medication by name, instead offering vague references to their ADHD treatment without specifying which particular stimulant they've been prescribed, a small act of self-protective omission that speaks volumes about how thoroughly the cultural narrative around methamphetamine has overwhelmed any nuanced understanding of its legitimate pharmaceutical applications. Healthcare providers themselves aren't entirely immune to this stigma either, despite their professional training and presumably greater familiarity with the pharmacological nuances involved. Some patients report encountering skepticism or additional scrutiny from new physicians or specialists unfamiliar with their case history, medical professionals who react with visible surprise or hesitation upon reviewing a chart that lists methamphetamine hydrochloride among a patient's current medications, even when that medication has been appropriately prescribed and monitored for years by a previous treating physician. It's a reminder that stigma doesn't respect professional credentials. It operates on cultural association regardless of how much specialized training someone has received. The pharmaceutical industry's own branding choices, ironically, may have exacerbated this exact problem over the decades. The name Desoxyn, chosen specifically to obscure the drug's chemical identity from patients and the general public back in the 1940s, has aged into something considerably more conspicuous than its creators likely anticipated. In an era of easily accessible medical information, where anyone can look up the active ingredient in any prescription within seconds, the branding strategy that once successfully distanced the medication from its chemical reality now serves as little more than a thin, easily penetrated veil, one that arguably draws more attention to the unusual nature of the prescription than a more transparent naming convention might have. What's perhaps most striking about this modern stigma is how disconnected it often is from any actual assessment of individual patient behavior or treatment outcomes. A patient taking Desoxyn exactly as prescribed, experiencing genuine therapeutic benefit with no signs of misuse or dependency, faces essentially the same social and professional skepticism as someone whose relationship with the drug might genuinely warrant concern. The stigma attaches to the molecule itself and the reputation that molecule carries from its decades of documented misuse and illegal manufacture, rather than to any individualized assessment of how a specific patient is actually using their specific, carefully monitored medication. It's a stigma that says considerably more about our collective cultural memory than it does about pharmacology, and it exists in sharp, almost comical contrast to how we treat the drug's much more culturally acceptable stimulant cousins. There's something worth naming about how selectively this particular stigma gets applied. Plenty of medications carry genuine abuse potential and complicated histories without triggering anywhere near the same visceral reaction Desoxyn's name still produces in casual conversation. The molecule's particular unluck lies in having become, through decades of unrelated cultural events entirely outside any individual patient's control, a kind of linguistic shorthand for catastrophe, a reputation that now follows anyone prescribed it, regardless of how carefully or appropriately their own treatment is actually being managed. Desoxyn shares a pharmacy shelf, at least in concept, with other stimulant medications like Adderall and Vivans, but the differences in molecular structure, potency and cultural perception between methamphetamine and its amphetamine relatives reveal just how much reputation shapes medicine independent of chemistry. At a purely chemical level, the differences between methamphetamine and the amphetamine compounds found in medications like Adderall are genuinely modest, involving a relatively small structural variation that nonetheless produces meaningful differences in how quickly and intensely each compound crosses into the brain. Methamphetamine's chemical structure allows it to penetrate the blood-brain barrier somewhat more efficiently than standard amphetamine, producing a generally more potent effect at equivalent doses, a pharmacological reality that partially justifies treating the two compounds with somewhat different levels of caution. But the magnitude of this chemical difference is nowhere near large enough to account for the absolutely dramatic disparity in how these medications are culturally perceived, marketed, and discussed in casual conversation. Adderall, despite being an amphetamine compound carrying its own genuine risks of dependency, misuse, and diversion, has achieved a level of cultural normalization that would have seemed almost unimaginable applied to Desoxyn. College students openly discuss using Adderall to study, without any of the shame or secrecy that would likely accompany an admission of taking a methamphetamine-based medication for the exact same purpose. Parents discuss their children's Adderall prescriptions at school functions with a casualness that simply doesn't extend to methamphetamine treatment, even when the underlying medical rationale and monitoring protocols are essentially identical. Vivansa, a prodrug that converts to active amphetamine only after metabolizing in the body, specifically designed to reduce abuse potential through this delayed activation mechanism, has been marketed with the same kind of glossy, aspirational advertising campaigns that Desoxyn enjoyed back in its 1950s heyday, complete with cheerful imagery of focused, successful patients tackling their daily responsibilities with newfound clarity. This disparity in cultural treatment reveals something genuinely important about how reputation, rather than pure pharmacology, shapes public and professional attitudes toward medication. Methamphetamine's decades-long association with illegal manufacture, addiction, and visible social devastation has created a reputational burden that no amount of legitimate pharmaceutical use under the Desoxyn brand name has managed to lift, even though the illegal street version and the carefully regulated pharmaceutical version share, at a molecular level, essentially the same active compound. Meanwhile, amphetamine, despite its own well-documented history of abuse, addiction, and diversion, particularly among college students and professionals seeking a competitive cognitive edge, has managed to maintain a considerably more benign public image, perhaps because its illegal manufacture and street-level distribution never reached the same visible, culturally dominant scale that methamphetamines did during the crisis years of the 1980s and 90s. There's an interesting question buried in this comparison about whether the differential treatment makes clinical sense or simply reflects historical accident and cultural momentum. Some addiction specialists argue that methamphetamine's genuinely greater potency and more efficient blood-brain barrier penetration justify treating it with somewhat greater caution than standard amphetamine compounds, a position with at least some pharmacological grounding. Others contend that the differential stigma has become wildly disproportionate to any actual difference in clinical risk, pointing to the fact that appropriately dosed, medically supervised Desoxyn treatment produces outcomes not meaningfully different from equivalent doses of other prescription stimulants once you control for the psychological burden of stigma itself, which can ironically make treatment adherence considerably more difficult for patients managing a medication that carries this kind of cultural baggage. What this comparison ultimately illustrates is a pattern that recurs throughout the entire history recounted in this episode. The same molecule, or in this case a family of closely related molecules, can occupy wildly different positions in the public imagination depending entirely on the packaging, branding, and cultural narrative surrounding it, factors that have remarkably little to do with the underlying chemistry itself. And that observation brings us finally to the uncomfortable question at the heart of this entire story, one that Desoxyn's strange, quiet survival into the present day forces us to confront directly. It's worth asking what it would take to actually recalibrate this disparity towards something more evidence-based. Probably nothing short of a sustained, deliberate public education effort, one considerably less glamorous and considerably harder to fund than the slick pharmaceutical marketing campaigns that built these unequal reputations in the first place. Reputations, once cemented into cultural common sense, tend to be far more durable than the facts that originally shaped them, a pattern this entire episode has now illustrated more than once. The fact that methamphetamine, in its purest legal form, still sits quietly on a small number of pharmacy shelves today, says something uncomfortable about the way society draws lines between medicine and poison, lines that often have less to do with the molecule itself than with who's taking it, why, and under whose supervision. Consider the strange journey this single chemical compound has taken across the better part of a century, from a German pharmaceutical laboratory to Wehrmacht supply lines, from American housewives' medicine cabinets to biker gang laboratories, from congressional hearing rooms to the narrow, carefully monitored prescription of a modern ADHD patient. At every single point along this journey, the molecule itself remained essentially unchanged. What changed, dramatically and repeatedly, was the context surrounding it. Who was distributing it? Who was regulating it? Who was consuming it? And what story the culture at large was telling itself about what that consumption meant. The exact same chemical compound has been simultaneously a legitimate wartime military tool, a housewife's diet aid, a criminal enterprise's primary product, and a carefully monitored treatment for a specific neurodevelopmental condition, sometimes within the very same decade. This raises an uncomfortable question that extends well beyond methamphetamine specifically, touching on how society approaches drug policy, medical regulation, and public health more broadly. If the same molecule can be simultaneously the most feared substance in American drug policy and a legitimate physician-prescribed medication sitting quietly in a labelled bottle, what does that tell us about the actual basis of our collective judgments regarding which substances deserve fear and which deserve trust? It suggests, uncomfortably, that these judgments have as much to do with delivery method, packaging, prescriber authority, and cultural narrative as they do with any purely pharmacological assessment of risk and benefit. A conclusion that should probably make anyone slightly more humble about how confidently we categorize substances as simply good or simply bad. There's also something worth reflecting on in how thoroughly institutional memory can fail to learn from its own history. The pharmaceutical industry's casual, aggressive marketing of Desoxyn throughout the 1940s and 50s built on inadequate understanding of dependency risk and an eagerness to expand the drug's approved uses well beyond any genuine medical necessity, established a pattern that would repeat itself in different form with subsequent classes of medications in the decades that followed. The specific chemical changes each time, but the underlying dynamic, a genuinely useful medication marketed far beyond its appropriate scope, driven by profit incentives that don't always align neatly with patient welfare, has proven remarkably durable across the intervening decades of supposedly improved pharmaceutical regulation and oversight. Yet Desoxyn's narrow, carefully monitored modern survival also demonstrates something more hopeful about how medical practice can genuinely evolve when confronted with sufficient evidence of harm. The casual, expansive prescribing of the 1950s has given way to a considerably more careful, evidence-based approach, one that reserves the medication for a specific, well-documented condition and surrounds its use with monitoring protocols that simply didn't exist during the drug's earlier decades. This evolution didn't happen quickly, and it didn't happen without considerable human cost along the way, but it did happen, suggesting that institutional learning, however slow and however painful, remains genuinely possible. Perhaps the most fitting way to close this particular story is to sit with the strange, quiet persistence of that small pharmacy shelf, tucked away in a small number of pharmacies willing to navigate the administrative burden of stocking it, serving a small population of patients whose relationship with methamphetamine bears almost no resemblance to the cultural narrative most Americans carry about the drug. It's a reminder that the line between medicine and poison has always been considerably blurrier and considerably more dependent on context than we generally like to admit, and that the same molecule, given a different bottle, a different prescriber, and a different story, can occupy almost any position along that blurry line at all. Maybe the real takeaway, as you drift off tonight, isn't a tidy conclusion about methamphetamine specifically, but a slightly uncomfortable invitation to hold your other confident categories a little more loosely. The medications in your own cabinet, the substances you consider obviously safe or obviously dangerous, all carry their own quiet histories of marketing, regulation, and cultural narrative shaping how you currently perceive them, histories that are, in all likelihood, considerably messier and more contingent than the clean label on the bottle would ever let on. If you mention methamphetamine to most Americans today, their minds don't drift toward pharmaceutical history or ADHD treatment protocols. They drift toward a chemistry teacher in a Winnebago, a specific shade of crystalline blue, and one of the most culturally dominant television narratives of the 21st century. The cultural phenomenon that redefined methamphetamine for an entire generation arrived not through a pharmacy or a congressional hearing, but through a television series about a high school chemistry teacher who turns to cooking meth after a terminal cancer diagnosis. The show's runaway success did something genuinely fascinating to the public perception of methamphetamine. It simultaneously humanized the drug's manufacturers through a sympathetic, relatable protagonist, while also cementing more thoroughly than any previous cultural artifact the association between methamphetamine and criminal enterprise, violence, and moral decay. It's a strange kind of cultural whiplash, watching audiences root for a character whose entire narrative arc depends on the exact same molecule that, in a small, unglamorous pharmacy bottle a few miles away, was being dispensed to an ADHD patient with a physician's careful blessing. What's particularly striking about this cultural moment is how completely it eclipsed any remaining public awareness of methamphetamine's pharmaceutical legitimacy. Ask someone who has watched every episode of that acclaimed television series whether methamphetamine has any legal medical use whatsoever, and you'll likely be met with genuine surprise, perhaps even disbelief at the suggestion. The show's meticulous attention to the chemistry and culture of illegal manufacturing, while dramatically compelling, left no meaningful narrative space for the quieter, considerably less cinematic story of a small pharmaceutical company continuing to legally manufacture and distribute the exact same chemical compound for entirely different purposes. This dominant cultural narrative has had genuine, measurable effects on the patients still legitimately prescribed Desoxyn today, adding yet another layer to the stigma already discussed earlier in this story. Imagine explaining your ADHD treatment to someone whose primary cultural reference point for methamphetamine is a fictional character's descent into criminal enterprise and moral compromise. The gap between that cultural touchstone and your own carefully monitored, entirely legal medical treatment can feel almost impossibly wide to bridge in casual conversation, and many patients simply choose not to attempt bridging it at all, opting instead for vague references to their stimulant medication, rather than inviting a conversation shaped entirely by fictional criminal drama. The television show's cultural impact extended beyond simple stigma too, influencing everything from law enforcement training references to popular slang, embedding methamphetamine ever more deeply into the American cultural imagination as something inherently criminal, inherently dangerous, and entirely disconnected from any legitimate medical context. This wasn't necessarily the creator's intent. The show was, after all, a work of fiction focused on illegal manufacturing and its consequences, with no particular obligation to also depict the drug's narrow pharmaceutical applications. But cultural narratives don't require intentional distortion to become dominant. They simply require sufficient reach and resonance, and few television properties in recent memory have achieved either quite as thoroughly as this particular series did. It's worth considering, as this episode winds toward its conclusion, just how much popular culture shapes our collective understanding of pharmacology, often far more powerfully than actual medical literature or regulatory history ever could. A television series watched by millions did more to define the American public's understanding of methamphetamine than 3 decades of congressional hearings, medical journal articles, and pharmaceutical marketing campaigns combined. That's either a testament to the power of compelling storytelling or a genuinely concerning indictment of how poorly complex pharmacological history competes against a well-written television drama for public attention, and it's probably, if we're being honest, a little bit of both. It's worth noting before we move on that this particular television-driven cultural moment wasn't unique in kind, even if it was unique in scale. Popular entertainment has shaped public understanding of pharmacology for as long as popular entertainment has existed, usually more effectively and more durably than whatever careful, nuanced messaging public health officials manage to produce. The lesson here isn't really about one specific show. It's about how thoroughly narrative competes with, and usually defeats, straightforward information whenever the two happen to collide in the public imagination. Every Schedule II medication carries an inherent tension. The same properties that make it therapeutically effective also make it valuable on illegal markets, and Desoxyn, despite its narrow legitimate prescribing base, hasn't entirely escaped this uncomfortable reality. Diversion, in pharmaceutical and law enforcement terminology, describes the process by which legally manufactured and prescribed medications end up being sold, traded, or distributed outside their intended medical channel, and it represents one of the most persistent challenges facing any controlled substance regulatory framework. For a drug like Desoxyn, whose active ingredient is chemically identical to a substance with substantial street value and demand, the potential for diversion exists regardless of how narrow the legitimate patient population has become. A small number of documented cases over the decades have involved patients selling portions of their prescriptions, physicians engaging in inappropriate prescribing for financial gain, or theft occurring somewhere along the supply chain between manufacturer and patient. The scale of this diversion problem for Desoxyn specifically is considerably smaller than for more commonly prescribed controlled substances, simply because the overall prescribing volume is so much lower than it was during the drug's mid-century heyday. But scale isn't the same as absence, and the regulatory apparatus surrounding the medication, the secure pharmacy storage, the detailed prescription documentation, the periodic physician monitoring, exists precisely because even a small diversion risk involving a drug this potent warrants serious institutional attention. It's a bit like installing an elaborate security system to protect a single valuable painting rather than an entire gallery. The scale of what's being protected doesn't change the seriousness with which the protection needs to be approached. Law enforcement agencies monitoring illegal methamphetamine distribution networks report the diverted pharmaceutical product, while it does occasionally surface, represents an almost negligible fraction of the overall illegal methamphetamine supply in the United States, which is overwhelmingly sourced from large-scale illegal manufacturing operations, both domestic and increasingly international, rather than from diverted prescription medication. This finding, somewhat reassuringly, suggests that the tightened regulatory framework established decades ago has been reasonably effective at preventing the kind of widespread pharmaceutical diversion that might otherwise be expected given the drug's underlying chemical identity and street value. Still, individual cases of diversion, however statistically rare, carry outsized weight in shaping both regulatory policy and public perception. A single documented instance of a physician running what amounts to a pill mill operation, prescribing Desoxyn or similar controlled substances with minimal medical justification in exchange for cash payments, generates exactly the kind of headline that reinforces public suspicion toward the entire category of legitimate prescribing, making life somewhat harder for the vast majority of patients and physicians engaged in entirely appropriate, carefully monitored treatment. It's an unfortunate but perhaps unavoidable dynamic in any regulatory system. The bad actors, however few in number, tend to shape public perception and policy discussion far more powerfully than the quiet, unremarkable majority simply following the rules. The ongoing challenge for regulators, then, involves calibrating oversight to address genuine diversion risk without creating such an overwhelming administrative burden that legitimate patients find themselves effectively unable to access medically necessary treatment. A balance that, as previous segments in this story have already illustrated, the current system arguably hasn't quite achieved. Too little oversight risks recreating the casual, expansive prescribing patterns that caused so much documented harm during the drug's earlier decades. Too much oversight risks abandoning a small population of legitimately diagnosed patients to a bureaucratic maze that makes consistent, effective treatment genuinely difficult to maintain. Finding the right balance between these two failure modes remains an ongoing project, one without any obvious permanently settled solution. So here you are, at the end of a very long, very strange chemical road trip, one that started in a 1930s Berlin laboratory and somehow ended in a small orange pharmacy bottle sitting quietly on a shelf near you tonight. Take a breath. You've earned it. We've covered 80 years of history in the space of one evening, and if your brain feels a little scattered right now, that's a completely reasonable response to following a single molecule through world wars, diet clinics, biker gangs, congressional hearings, and prestige television. Let it settle. There's nowhere else you need to be. Think back for a moment on everyone who passed through this story without ever knowing they were part of something so much larger than their own life. The German chemists testing dosages on themselves in a lab that smelled faintly of solvent and ambition, with no idea their work would eventually cross an ocean. The housewife in 1952, exhausted from a day that never technically ended, trusting her doctor completely because trusting her doctor was simply what you did back then. The truck driver squinting through the windshield at 3 a.m, the college student cramming for an exam that felt at the time like the single most important test of their entire life. None of them were reckless. None of them were foolish. They were just people, doing their best with the information and the trust the world had given them. And most of that information turned out to be considerably less reliable than anyone had promised. There's a particular kind of tenderness worth extending toward all of them tonight, even the ones who made choices that look, from this comfortable historical distance, a little questionable. It's easy to judge a 1950s physician for handing out methamphetamine like breath mints. It's harder and more honest to admit that we are all, right now, living inside our own version of that same story, trusting institutions and treatments that some future audience, listening to their own version of this podcast 80 years from now, will shake their heads at with exactly the same mixture of disbelief and pity we've extended tonight toward Abbott Laboratories and its glossy magazine advertisements. History doesn't stop repeating this particular pattern just because we've gotten better at spotting it in hindsight. And then there's the other side of this story, the quieter, less cinematic one that rarely gets told alongside the meth lab raids and the crystalline blue chemistry sets of popular imagination. The patient today, carefully diagnosed, carefully monitored, driving to 3 different pharmacies just to fill a prescription that genuinely helps them function, carrying a stigma they never asked for and did nothing to earn. If you know someone like that, or if you happen to be someone like that yourself, tonight is a good night to remember that a molecule's history isn't the same thing as your own. You're not required to carry 80 years of cultural baggage that has nothing to do with your actual, individual, carefully considered treatment. Sleep easier knowing that. There's something almost soothing, honestly, in recognizing just how much of this entire saga came down to marketing, branding, and the stories institutions chose to tell rather than any fixed, permanent truth about the molecule itself. Methamphetamine wasn't inherently a wartime tool, or a housewife's helper, or a criminal's product, or a specialist's last resort. It was, and remains, simply a chemical compound, indifferent to all the meaning we've piled onto it across 8 decades. The danger and the benefit were always real, but the story surrounding them, the fear, the shame, the aspirational advertising, the prestige television, all of that was built by us, layer by layer, decade by decade, out of very human impulses toward profit, control, and the eternal desire to simply feel a little less tired. So as you drift off tonight, let yourself feel a small, quiet gratitude for the parts of modern medicine that have actually improved since those freewheeling decades of casual prescribing. Somewhere out there tonight, a physician is making a careful, well-documented decision about a patient's treatment, weighing risk and benefit with a rigor that simply didn't exist when your grandmother's doctor handed her a bottle for her nerves without a second thought. That kind of institutional caution took decades and considerable human cost to build, and it's still not perfect, but it's real, and it's worth appreciating on a night like tonight, tucked into your own bed, under your own roof, with nothing more urgent on your agenda than sleep. And maybe, as your eyes get heavy, and this whole strange history starts to blur into something softer and more distant, spare a passing thought for how much of what surrounds you right now, your medications, your habits, your quiet evening routines, is itself a story still being written. one that some future version of a Sleepy History podcast will eventually get around to telling. We rarely recognize the chapters we're living through as chapters at all. We just live them, one unremarkable day at a time, trusting the people and institutions around us the same way every generation before us has, for better and for worse. Rest well tonight. You've earned it, and so, in their own complicated, imperfect way, did every single person who passed through this story before you. Sleep tight, stay curious, and we'll see you next time wherever history decides to take us.